Some plans are made to avoid disappointment rather than invite comfort. Michael Reed had learned the careful discipline of choosing less conversation, less eye contact, less hope that might turn into something heavy. The quiet table near the far wall of the diner wasn't accidental, it was strategic. From that seat, he could observe without participating, exist without explaining. After years of loss that arrived without warning and rejection that came wrapped in polite excuses, solitude had become the one thing he could rely on without fear. He lowered himself into the chair with a practiced stillness, shoulders slightly tense, as if even the furniture might expect something from him. The menu lay untouched beneath his hand. He didn't need to read it yet. Instead, he listened. Plates clinked, voices overlapped, laughter spilled freely from booths filled with families and couples. It was a loud reminder of togetherness, and Michael had learned how to position himself just outside of it. Eating alone wasn't loneliness to him, it was control. Across from him sat his triplets, close enough that their knees almost touched. Noah, Eli, and May were quiet, not because silence had been demanded, but because they understood it. Children learn quickly when noise brings questions, and questions bring pain. Years of watching their father pull inward had taught them how to read the smallest changes in his expression, how to sense when the world felt too sharp for him. They were young, but they had become careful guardians of emotional space. Michael ordered in a low, even voice, thanking the waitress without meeting her eyes. He told himself this was just a meal. No conversation beyond necessity. No expectations beyond being fed. Solitude, he believed, was safer than hope because hope had a way of leaving without explanation. Solitude stayed exactly as it was. The diner refused to stay neutral. Families leaned into one another. Couples shared stories between bites. Strangers exchanged brief smiles that hinted at warmth without obligation. Michael kept his gaze fixed on the table, tracing the worn patterns in the wood. He had mastered the art of being present without being seen, a skill honed after too many moments of being overlooked or chosen last. The triplets noticed what he avoided. Noah watched a father nearby laugh freely, the sound unguarded. Eli observed the gentle patience of a server helping an elderly woman with her coat. May's attention lingered on a woman sitting alone a few tables away, her expression soft as she smiled at a child passing by. None of the children spoke, but their shared glances carried quiet understanding. They knew when questions would only make things heavier. Michael sensed their attention drift and felt his shoulders tighten. He assumed hunger or boredom, normal things children felt. What he didn't see was that their focus had shifted outward, beyond the table he had chosen as a barrier. He reminded himself that people came and went, that kindness was often temporary, and that staying was rare enough to feel dangerous. When the food arrived, steam rising gently from the plate, Michael allowed himself a small exhale. This part was manageable. Eat, pay, leave. No emotional cost, no lingering moments. The thought brought relief wrapped in a familiar ache, the kind he had stopped trying to name, but... The triplets leaned in slightly, their movements synchronized in a way that made Michael glance up despite himself. May's fingers tightened around her napkin. Noah's restless foot stilled. Eli tilted his head, curiosity overtaking caution. Their attention wasn't on the food or the door. It was fixed on someone nearby, someone Michael had already dismissed without truly seeing. The contrast in the room sharpened. Michael had chosen isolation, while the diner pulsed with connection. He expected nothing, while something quiet hovered just beyond his awareness. Children often sense shifts adults ignore, and the triplets felt it clearly. This wasn't about appearances or status or a presence that demanded notice. It was subtle, almost invisible, like the possibility of being chosen without asking. Michael took a bite, unaware that his careful plan was already beginning to fracture. The safety he'd built from silence was fragile, and something unfamiliar was pressing against it. Kindness he hadn't prepared for. Connection he no longer trusted. The children knew before he did that this evening was no longer just a meal. The triplets exchanged a knowing look because they had noticed someone their father had already decided didn't matter. After enough rejection, distance feels like maturity. Michael Reed used to believe that closeness was proof of effort, that showing up emotionally was a way to build something lasting. That belief had been slowly dismantled over time, not by one dramatic ending, but by a series of quiet exits that left him standing alone with explanations that never quite explained anything. People left with soft apologies and reasonable excuses, and Michael learned that what hurt most wasn't the leaving itself, but how easily it happened. Somewhere along the way, he decided that distance wasn't bitterness, it was growth, or at least that's what he told himself. Single parenthood narrowed his world in ways he never expected. It wasn't just the schedules or the constant calculations of time and money, it was the emotional arithmetic that consumed him. Every decision was filtered through one question: would this make life steadier for the kids? Romance felt unpredictable, friendships felt optional, and vulnerability felt like a luxury he could no longer afford. When it was just him, he could absorb disappointment. When it involved the triplets, disappointment felt irresponsible, so he simplified. He built a life that ran on routines and quiet strength. Solitude became synonymous with stability. If he didn't invite anyone too close, no one could disrupt the fragile balance he'd created. The children had already endured enough change. He wouldn't be the reason for more. In his mind, keeping to himself wasn't avoidance, it was protection. The exhaustion came later, slipping in unnoticed. Michael learned how to mask it well, mistaking self-sufficiency for resilience. He woke early, worked long, and smiled just enough to reassure the kids that everything was fine. By the time night arrived, there was little left of him to give, but he convinced himself that this was what strength looked like. Tiredness became his baseline, and he stopped remembering what it felt like to be rested in ways that weren't physical. He avoided moments that invited vulnerability with practiced precision. Conversations stayed practical. Compliments were deflected. Invitations were declined with polite certainty. It wasn't that he didn't want connection. It was that connection came with questions, and questions came with expectations. Expectations he knew too well could collapse without warning. Avoiding them felt like wisdom earned the hard way. The triplets watched all of this without commentary. Children learn empathy not from lectures but from observation, and they had become experts in reading restraint. They noticed how their father paused before answering personal questions, how his laughter softened when it lingered too long, how he redirected conversations before they turned emotional. From him, they learned that caring deeply didn't always mean speaking loudly. Sometimes it meant holding back. Noah learned to listen before reacting. Eli learned to notice when someone needed space rather than comfort. May learned that feelings didn't have to be displayed to be real. Their emotional intelligence grew quietly, shaped by a household where love was constant but carefully contained. Michael believed he was teaching them strength. He didn't realize he was also teaching them how to see what he refused to. He told himself that staying emotionally contained was a way of staying present, that by limiting his own needs, he could be more available for theirs. In truth, he was surviving rather than living. But survival felt noble when it came with sacrifice. He had stayed when others left. He had endured when walking away might have been easier. Surely that counted for something. Still, there were moments when the loneliness crept in, uninvited and persistent. Not the dramatic kind, but the quiet awareness that no one asked how he was coping, that no one chose him without obligation. He pushed those thoughts aside, reminding himself that being chosen wasn't necessary when he had chosen responsibility instead. What Michael didn't see was how the children interpreted his restraint differently. To them, his silence wasn't absence, it was patience. His distance wasn't rejection, it was waiting. Where he saw caution, they sensed unspoken hope. Where he believed solitude was safer, they believed it was temporary. They understood something he hadn't allowed himself to consider, that staying alone might have been a season, not a sentence. That being careful didn't mean being closed forever. They watched the world with open curiosity, not fear, and they noticed possibilities their father had trained himself to ignore. Michael thought he was teaching them how to endure. The truth was, they were learning how to recognize moments that asked for more than endurance, moments that asked for courage of a different kind. While Michael saw distance as responsibility, the children saw it as a pause, one they believed was about to end. Children often recognize loneliness before adults admit it exists. Noah noticed it first, not because he was looking for it, but because he had learned to read stillness, the way a person held their shoulders, the way their eyes lingered too long on moments that weren't meant for them. He saw it in the space a few tables away, in someone sitting just outside the natural flow of the diner. It was the same quiet distance he had seen in his father countless times, the kind that didn't ask for attention but carried weight anyway. Eli picked up on it next, sensitive to patterns others ignored. He noticed how that person wasn't checked on as often, how conversations curved around them instead of including them. Adults were good at missing these things, he had learned. They filled silence with assumptions and told themselves stories that made it easier not to pause. Children didn't do that. They felt first and explained later. May didn't say anything, but her gaze stayed fixed, gentle and curious. She had a way of sensing when someone was being overlooked rather than choosing to be alone. There was a difference, and she knew it instinctively. Her fingers tapped lightly against the table, a quiet signal her brothers understood. Something mattered here. The triplets had grown up watching their father read rooms like a map of potential risks. Michael noticed exits before people, pauses before possibilities. He believed boundaries kept everyone safe, especially them. So when the children sensed his attention pulling inward again, they understood what was happening. He was bracing, not for danger, but for feeling something he didn't want to explain. They exchanged a glance, brief and practiced. Years of shared experiences had taught them how to communicate without words. Noah raised his eyebrows slightly. Eli tilted his head. May pressed her lips together, thoughtful. This wasn't about curiosity alone. It was about recognition. They saw loneliness because they had lived alongside it, watched it settle into their father like a familiar guest. Michael shifted in his chair, aware of their focus but misreading its cause. He assumed they were distracted, maybe restless. His instinct was immediate and protective. Don't engage. Don't invite complexity. He believed boundaries were acts of love, invisible walls that kept disappointment from reaching the people he cared about most. The idea of crossing those boundaries made his chest tighten. But the children weren't thinking about risk. They were thinking about connection. To them, openness wasn't naive, it was natural. They hadn't learned yet to fear small kindnesses or measure every interaction by its potential cost. Where adults hesitated, calculating outcomes, the triplets leaned toward moments that felt human. They noticed how the person nearby smiled at small things, how that smile faded when it wasn't returned. They noticed how plates were cleared without conversation, how no one asked the simplest questions. It reminded them of nights when their father sat quietly after they'd gone to bed, the house filled with effort but not ease. Loneliness had a texture, and they recognized it. Michael cleared his throat softly, a signal the children knew meant he was preparing to redirect them. He didn't want attention drawn. He didn't want explanations. Most of all, he didn't want Hope entering the room uninvited. Hope had a way of rearranging things, and rearranging things felt dangerous. The contrast between them was subtle but profound. Michael believed safety came from control. The triplets believed safety came from care. He had learned to stay by holding back. They had learned to stay by leaning in. Neither was wrong, but only one of them was willing to test the moment. Their understanding deepened without discussion. Noah understood that waiting for permission might mean waiting forever. Eli understood that their father's caution came from love, not indifference. May understood that sometimes kindness had to move first, before fear could speak louder. Together, they reached the same conclusion without ever saying it out loud. Michael watched them shift in their seats, felt the energy change, and tried to steady it with routine. He reached for his glass, grounded himself in familiar motions. He didn't see what they saw. He didn't want to. Seeing it would mean admitting that loneliness wasn't always chosen, that sometimes it was something that lingered because no one crossed the space between tables. The children leaned closer to one another, a quiet huddle formed from shared certainty. This wasn't about fixing anything or rescuing anyone. It was about acknowledgement, about letting someone know they had been seen. To them, that felt as natural as breathing. Michael sensed movement and looked up just as they began to shift away from the table. His instinct flared, protective and sharp, but slower than their resolve. For a moment, the careful balance he had built wavered, challenged not by conflict, but by compassion. Before Michael could speak, the triplets acted together, making a choice he hadn't given them permission to make. Kindness often begins by rearranging space. The movement was small, almost unnoticeable. To anyone not already watching closely. Chairs shifted. A gap at the table widened. It wasn't dramatic or loud, but it carried intention. Noah was the first to stand, his motion careful rather than impulsive. Eli followed, steady and quiet, while May looked once at their father before turning away, her expression gentle but resolved. Together they created an opening where none had existed before. They didn't speak immediately. Words felt unnecessary. Instead, Noah gestured toward the empty chair, a simple invitation that carried no expectation. It wasn't framed as help or charity. It was an offer of space, nothing more. The unexpected guest looked up, clearly startled, eyes flicking from the children to Michael and back again. Surprise softened into hesitation, the kind that comes from being unaccustomed to being noticed. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. The diner's noise continued, but at that table, time stretched thin. The guest smiled politely, unsure, hands hovering near their place setting as if afraid of intruding. There was no rush from the children, no pleading or explanation. They simply waited, their openness unguarded and calm. Michael felt the shift immediately, a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with losing control. This wasn't how the evening was supposed to go. He had planned for quiet, for predictability. He had planned to leave untouched by anyone else's story. Watching his children invite someone into that carefully protected space felt like watching a door open that he had deliberately kept closed. He didn't stop them. Part of him wanted to, instinctively reaching for the rules he had built to keep things manageable. But another part, quieter and older, recognized the absence of pressure in what they were doing. There was no pity in their posture, no urgency in their faces. They weren't trying to fix anything. They were simply acknowledging another human being. The guest hesitated again, glancing around as if seeking permission from the room itself. Then, slowly, they moved the chair closer. The sound it made against the floor was soft but definitive, like a decision settling into place. When they sat, it wasn't with relief or triumph, but with cautious gratitude, as if unsure how long this moment might last. Social boundaries dissolved without announcement. No one explained why this was happening. No one apologized for it. The table expanded in purpose as much as in size. Plates were shifted, napkins adjusted, space redistributed in quiet cooperation. The children resumed their seats, satisfied, as if this arrangement had always been an option. Michael watched, aware of his own discomfort, and something else underneath it. A loosening, the kind that comes when control gives way to connection. He realized how much energy he had spent maintaining distance, how exhausting it was to hold the line against moments like this. His children had crossed it effortlessly, not out of rebellion, but out of instinct. Conversation didn't rush in. It arrived slowly, respectfully. A comment about the food. A shared smile over a spilled drink quickly corrected. Laughter didn't burst, it warmed. The emotional atmosphere at the table shifted from guarded to gentle, from contained to open enough to breathe. Michael found himself listening rather than monitoring, present in a way he had expected. The guest spoke cautiously at first, as if testing the ground. The children responded with curiosity that wasn't invasive, warmth that didn't demand anything in return. Their questions were simple, their attention sincere. Michael noticed how the guests' shoulders lowered, how their voice steadied. Being included, he realized, didn't require a speech. Sometimes it just required a seat. He felt something unfamiliar move through him. Not fear, not regret, but the beginning of something hopeful. The idea that stability didn't have to mean isolation. That safety might also exist in moments he hadn't planned for. Watching his children navigate the world with such quiet confidence made him question the limits he had placed on all of them. The diner returned to its rhythm around them, but the table remained changed. This was no longer a private meal defined by silence. It had become a shared moment, defined by choice. The kind of choice that stays even when others leave. The kind that doesn't announce itself as redemption, but feels like the start of it. Michael caught the guest's eye briefly, an unspoken acknowledgement passing between them. No promises were made, no futures imagined, just a recognition of the present and the possibility it carried. As the plates emptied and time stretched on, the unexpected guest paused, clearly weighing one quiet question, whether to stay a little longer. Inclusion heals wounds attention never reaches. She had grown used to the feeling of being adjacent to life rather than inside it. The woman had learned how to occupy space without claiming it, how to sit still enough that no one felt obligated to notice her. Over time, being overlooked stopped feeling like an accident and started feeling like a pattern. She told herself it was easier that way. Expectations had a habit of bruising when they weren't met. Rejection had never arrived loudly for her. It came in softened tones, polite smiles, and conversations that slowly stopped. Friendships faded when she needed consistency. Relationships dissolved when she needed patience. She had learned to carry her loneliness neatly, folding it into routines so it wouldn't spill out in public places like this diner. Sitting alone wasn't dramatic, it was familiar. That familiarity was why the invitation caught her so completely off guard. It hadn't come wrapped in sympathy or framed as concern. 3 children had simply made room, their gesture quiet and unforced, as if inclusion were the most natural thing in the world. No questions, no explanations required, just space. She had hesitated because habit told her to. Years of being unseen had trained her to second-guess moments like this, to search for hidden costs. But there was none in their faces. Only openness. Only the calm certainty that she belonged at the table if she chose to sit. As she settled into the chair, something inside her softened. Emotional warmth replaced the guarded distance she usually carried into shared spaces. The children didn't study her like a problem to solve. They spoke to her like a person already accepted. That simple shift reached places attention never had. Places long untouched by kindness. She noticed the father then, really noticed him. The tension he carried was familiar. A kind she recognized immediately. He was uncomfortable, yes, but not resistant. There was relief there too, barely concealed, as if part of him had been waiting for someone else to cross the line he couldn't. Their eyes met briefly, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Neither apologized for the moment. Neither claimed it. They just allowed it to exist. Being included without explanation did something unexpected to her. It reminded her of who she had been before she learned to shrink herself. Before she learned that staying quiet was easier than risking dismissal. Trust began forming without intention, not as a commitment, but as a feeling. A sense that she didn't have to perform or justify her presence. Conversation grew gently, like something finding its way, rather than being pushed forward. The children asked simple questions, shared small stories, laughed easily. Their curiosity wasn't invasive. It was warm. She found herself responding without rehearsing, without guarding every word. Her voice sounded steadier than she expected. The father listened more than he spoke, but when he did, there was care in his tone. She sensed how carefully he navigated the world, how much he carried for the sake of the children. There was resilience there, worn but real. Staying when others leave leaves marks, and she recognized them in him. It made her feel less alone in her own endurance. For the first time that day, the thought of leaving felt heavy, not because she felt obligated, but because she felt chosen. The difference mattered. Loneliness doesn't always come from being alone. Sometimes it comes from never being invited to stay. Here, staying felt possible. She realized how rare it was to be welcomed without context. No one asked where she came from or why she was alone. No one tried to define her by absence. She was simply there, and that was enough. Found family doesn't announce itself. It begins quietly, in moments like this, when belonging is offered without demand. As plates emptied and time stretched, she became aware of an unfamiliar reluctance to move. Walking away would mean returning to the edges, to places where she blended back into the background. Staying meant risking the ache of connection, but also the promise of it. Hope stirred, cautious but present, asking to be considered. She glanced at the children, then at their father, feeling the weight of the choice forming inside her. This moment was no longer just kind, it was meaningful, and meaningful moments are harder to leave behind. As she reached for her coat, her hand paused, because for the first time in a long while, walking away felt harder than staying. Belonging often forms before anyone names it. The change didn't arrive all at once. It unfolded quietly, like warmth spreading through a room after a door is closed against the cold. What had started as cautious politeness softened into something easier, something that didn't require constant awareness. The tension that once hovered at the edges of the table began to loosen, replaced by a rhythm that felt almost familiar. No one acknowledged it out loud, but everyone felt it. The triplets were at the center of that shift without ever claiming it. They moved naturally between their father and the woman, asking questions that invited stories without prying, sharing small observations that made everyone smile. When conversation stalled, they didn't rush to fill it. They let silence exist without discomfort, turning pauses into rest rather than distance. In doing so, they became emotional bridges, connecting people who might otherwise have remained cautious on opposite sides of the table. For the woman, safety arrived subtly. It wasn't declared or promised. It was felt in the way her words were received without judgment, in how her presence was treated as expected rather than exceptional. She noticed how no one flinched when she spoke, how her laughter didn't feel out of place. Being seen without being evaluated allowed her shoulders to relax, allowed her to take up space without apology. It had been a long time since she felt that ease. Michael observed all of this with a mix of disbelief and quiet reflection. He had spent years defining connection as something fragile, easily broken if handled without care. Watching it form so naturally challenged that belief. This wasn't loud or overwhelming. It didn't demand commitment or clarity. It simply existed, steady and unforced. For the first time in a long while, he considered that connection didn't have to be risky to be real. He found himself participating without overthinking, responding instead of rehearsing. The careful guard he usually kept began to lower, not because he decided to trust, but because trust was already happening around him. The children weren't managing the moment, they were living it. Their ease made it harder for him to justify holding back. Redefining connection, he realized, might mean allowing moments to be imperfect rather than controlled. Healing unfolded quietly, without promises or labels. No one spoke about the future or tried to define what this gathering meant. There were no assumptions layered onto the moment. That absence of expectation made everything feel lighter. The woman didn't feel pressure to impress or explain. Michael didn't feel pressure to protect or perform. The children didn't feel pressure to mediate. Everyone simply stayed. Isolation, which had once felt permanent, began to loosen its grip. It didn't vanish, but it shifted, making room for something else. Loneliness transformed from a defining state into a passing feeling, acknowledged but no longer in charge. The table held more than plates now. It held shared attention, shared presence, and the quiet understanding that staying could be a choice rather than an obligation. Time moved differently. What might have felt like minutes stretched into something fuller. Michael noticed how easily laughter came, how conversation circled back naturally. He felt a strange mix of relief and caution, aware that this sense of belonging was fragile, but also aware that avoiding fragility had cost him more than he admitted. Staying when others leave requires endurance, but allowing someone to stay requires courage of a different kind. The woman felt it too, that careful balance between comfort and awareness. She knew moments like this didn't always last. She also knew that their value wasn't diminished by impermanence. Found family, she realized, didn't always announce itself with permanence. Sometimes it existed simply to remind you that connection was still possible, that you were still capable of being chosen. The triplets sensed the fullness of the moment in their own way. They didn't analyze it or try to preserve it. They enjoyed it, trusting that what felt right now was enough. Their confidence came from lived experience. They had learned that staying present mattered more than predicting outcomes. As the diner began to thin and the sounds around them changed, a subtle awareness crept in. The world outside the table hadn't paused. Responsibilities waited. Schedules would resume. Reality, patient and persistent, edged closer. Michael felt it like a distant vibration. The reminder that moments like this were rare and easily interrupted. No one rushed to end it. No one rushed to hold on to it either. They lingered in the space between, where belonging existed without definition. But beneath the comfort, there was an unspoken recognition that something would soon demand attention, pulling them back into separate paths. Just as the table settled into its quiet ease, an interruption loomed, threatening to break the moment they hadn't realized they were hoping would last. Fear resurfaces whenever hope feels unplanned. Michael felt it before he could name it, that familiar tightening in his chest that arrived whenever something good lingered too long. The comfort at the table had grown quiet and real, and that was precisely what unsettled him. Experience had taught him that unplanned hope often came with a cost, one he usually paid later, alone. Old doubts stirred, reminding him why he had chosen isolation so carefully in the first place. His mind drifted backward without permission, replaying moments where connection had felt safe until it suddenly wasn't. Promises that had softened into distance. People who stayed just long enough to leave an imprint before disappearing. He had learned to expect the shift, to sense when warmth would cool. Sitting there now, surrounded by ease and laughter, he wondered when the other shoe would drop. Across the table, the woman felt a parallel tension rise within her. The comfort she had settled into began to feel fragile, like something she might accidentally break just by wanting it too much. She became aware of how long she had stayed, how easily time had passed. Old instincts whispered, "Kal, Yushin, don't overstay. Don't turn welcome into burden." She smiled, still present, but part of her had already begun preparing for a graceful exit. The triplets noticed both shifts without alarm. Emotional steadiness had become second nature to them. They sensed the subtle changes in posture, the pauses that lasted a beat too long. But unlike the adults, they didn't interpret these moments as warnings. To them, fluctuation was normal. Feelings moved, moments changed. That didn't mean they had to end. Michael watched his children closely, struck by their calm. They weren't clinging to the moment or bracing for loss. They simply remained where they were, open and grounded. It made him question the reflex that told him to retreat. He felt pulled between two instincts that had shaped his life. The urge to withdraw before disappointment could arrive, and the quieter urge to stay, even when staying felt uncertain. The internal struggle grew heavier. Leaving emotionally had always been easier than risking vulnerability. Self-protection was familiar territory, mapped and predictable. But looking at the table now, he wondered what that protection had cost him over time. How many moments had he exited early, convincing himself it was responsibility rather than fear? The woman shifted slightly, hands folding together, her body language polite and contained. Michael recognized it instantly. He had done the same thing countless times. It was the posture of someone preparing to disappear without making it awkward. The realization startled him. For the first time, he wasn't just aware of his own defenses, but of someone else's mirroring them. Something in him resisted that ending. Not doctor. Amatically, not with urgency, but with intention. He chose to remain emotionally present, even as doubt pressed in. He met her eyes and didn't look away. The simple act felt braver than any grand gesture. Vulnerability, he realized, didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it was just staying still instead of stepping back. The woman noticed the shift immediately. His attention didn't feel demanding or evaluative. It felt steady. That steadiness softened her own hesitation. She relaxed her grip on her belongings, allowing herself to remain a little longer without apology. Trust, fragile, but growing, stretched quietly between them. The triplets, sensing the recalibration, resumed their easy rhythm. They talked, listened, laughed softly. Their presence anchored the table, reminding both adults that connection didn't have to be negotiated through fear. The children weren't afraid of disappointment. They had learned resilience not by avoiding loss, but by surviving it together. Michael felt something change inside him. Vulnerability began to replace self-protection, not because the risk had vanished, but because the cost of retreat felt heavier than the risk of staying. He realized that avoiding disappointment had also meant avoiding joy. That solitude had protected him, yes, but it had also narrowed his world. The woman felt it too, that quiet permission to exist without calculating an exit strategy. She didn't know what this moment meant beyond itself, and for once she didn't need to. Being chosen, even temporarily, was enough. Staying when others leave had shaped her endurance, but being invited to stay reshaped her hope. The air at the table shifted again, but this time, it felt intentional rather than fragile. Michael understood something he hadn't before. This moment wasn't dangerous because it might end. It was meaningful because it existed at all. Fear had been telling him to protect himself from loss, but courage was asking him to accept presence. He looked around the table, at his children, at the woman, at the shared ease they had built without planning. A realization settled, quiet but firm, changing how he understood everything that had happened that evening. Michael realized that the reason this moment felt frightening wasn't because it might end, but because it had already begun to matter. Some nights changed direction without warning. The evening no longer felt like something to endure. It had shifted into something that carried weight, not heavy but meaningful. What began as a quiet meal designed to pass unnoticed had slowly transformed into a shared experience that none of them had planned for, yet all of them were participating in fully. The change wasn't marked by a single moment. It lived in the way everyone lingered, in how no one checked the time anymore. For the woman, the shift was profound. She was no longer measuring her presence by how invisible she could remain. The edges she usually occupied had softened, replaced by a sense of being held within the moment rather than circling it. She felt herself respond more freely. Her thoughts no longer filtered through the fear of being overlooked. For once, she wasn't defined by absence. She was defined by participation. Michael felt the transformation just as deeply, though it unsettled him at first. He realized he was no longer hiding behind isolation or using responsibility as a shield. The table no longer felt like a boundary he needed to defend. It felt like a place where he could exist without constant vigilance. The control he once clung to loosened, replaced by something unfamiliar but welcome: presence. He watched his children closely, struck by the quiet confidence with which they navigated the moment. The triplets weren't performing kindness, they were living it. They witnessed compassion modeled not through instruction but through action. They saw how a small decision could change the emotional shape of a room. This wasn't a lesson they would forget. It wasn't framed as morality or duty. It was framed as humanity. Noah noticed how laughter came more easily now, how it didn't feel like something borrowed. Eli observed the way adults softened when they felt safe, how tension faded when no one was bracing for rejection. May absorbed it all, understanding without words that belonging could be built, not demanded. These were quiet understandings, but they were powerful. The idea of chosen family began forming without anyone naming it. There were no declarations or expectations placed on the future. What mattered was the present, the shared attention, the mutual care. Found family, they all sensed in different ways, didn't require history or obligation. It required willingness. It required staying when leaving would have been easier. Hope moved through the table subtly, replacing the quiet resignation each of them had carried in their own way. For Michael, it was the realization that protecting his children didn't mean shutting the world out. For the woman, it was the understanding that being chosen didn't always come with conditio. For the children, it was confirmation that compassion could be trusted. The diner began to thin, but none of them rushed to fill the space left behind. The noise faded into a background hum, leaving their table suspended in a moment that felt gently separate from the rest of the night. Plates sat empty, but no one moved to stand. Staying felt natural now, not something to justify. Michael felt a quiet pride as he watched the children interact. Not because they had done something remarkable, but because they had done something true to themselves. He realized that resilience wasn't just about surviving loss. It was about remaining open after it. The children had learned that not from words, but from watching him endure. They were teaching him something in return. The woman glanced at the door once, then back at the table. Leaving would have been easier earlier. Now, it felt like stepping away from something unfinished. She didn't mistake the moment for certainty or permanence. She simply recognized its value. Moments like this didn't need guarantees to matter. Michael caught her hesitation and felt a surprising calm. Whatever happened next didn't need to be defined immediately. He didn't need to decide where this led or what it meant. All he needed to do was remain present. That realization alone felt like redemption. The triplets sensed the shift forward without knowing its shape. They understood that this night would be remembered, not because of where it led, but because of how it began. With space made at a table, with kindness offered without status or expectation, with loneliness transformed into something shared. As they finally began to gather their things, there was no rush, no awkwardness. The moment stretched just enough to be acknowledged. It didn't cling, it didn't demand, it simply existed, complete in itself, yet open to continuation. What had started as a solitary meal had become a turning point, not dramatic, but real. A quiet reminder that life could still surprise them, that connection could still arrive unannounced, that staying was sometimes the bravest choice of all. As they stepped away from the table together, it became clear that what began alone was no longer moving forward that way. If this story stayed with you longer than you expected, that feeling matters. Stories like this only travel when they're shared, so if it moved you, let it move someone else too. Stay with this channel by liking, sharing, and subscribing, because the quiet moments are often the ones worth returning for. And here's the question I'll leave you with. If someone had quietly made space for you on your loneliest day, would you have taken the seat or walked away?